Okay, so, I thought it was worth doing one, case study on the Rav as Posek, because, well, he's the Rav, but also, the Rav really didn't do Psak very much. A lot of the things that we have that are basically, essentially Tshuvot, are English letters that he wrote, and one of the things I think is worth noting about Psak is that Psak doesn't have to be in Hebrew, right? It can be in whatever language. Though Aviad Cohen really, in a very systematic article, points out that you can really analyze who a posek thinks he's talking to based on certain things that, from a lamdan's perspective, are accidental. Like, what language does he use? Right? The fact that most of what we have in terms of psak from the Rav is in English, right, speaks to who he thinks he's talking to. Right? Means he's talking to, as we'll see, he's talking straight to the Balabatim, right? And not necessarily educated Balabatim, such that they could understand it if he wrote to them in Hebrew. Right? That's a big deal, right? And that shows something about what you think psak is. If you think, you can join us. If you have to leave, you can have to leave. It's not like Aviad Cohen makes this point that the difference between Haredi Tshuvot in the 20th century and religious Zionist ones in the 20th century, that most Haredi Tshuvot are written in Lishna D'Rabbanan, and most religious Zionist ones are written in modern Hebrew, which isn't just a style. It's not just a style choice. It's a question of who you're writing to, right? If you write in modern Hebrew, that's a claim that the people who are reading are people who are proficient in modern Hebrew, not necessarily Yoshua Beis Medrash, but right. Now, there are certain outliers. Right? Which Haredi Gadol only wrote in modern Hebrew? People don't realize this, but he only wrote in Chazon Ish. Right? The Chazon Ish only. I know that was a total guess, but it's a good guess. No. But he only wrote in modern Hebrew. Right? It's written in modern Hebrew. It's not written in Lishon D'Rabbanan. Not at all. Right? Which is interesting. He also notes that you can tell a lot by how people organize. The fact that religious Zionist community, right, probably the most prominent halachic work that has come out from the religious Zionist community in the last 30 years is Tchumen, right? That's the journal that they have every year, which is very serious halachic pieces, but they're organized like articles, right, with subsections, right? And he said that means that the audience that they think they're talking to is probably academically inclined. Just enough that they appreciate that, right? Because that's not how classic Tshuvot are written, but it is how academic journals, right? I mean, you can sort of, right, act like an archaeologist and pick apart just the style to figure out what is it that a posek is. Who does he think he's talking to, right? What is he trying to accomplish? And I find it very interesting that a lot of what we have, to the extent of right, the Rav didn't write a lot. Everyone knows that, right? But to the extent that we have written halachic things for the Rav, most of them are in English. There were just letters that he gave to people over the years, right? He didn't sit down and write a tshuva sefer. But you read his tshuvot, they're mostly collected in this book, Community, Covenant, and Commitment. They're very lumdish, right? What comes across is a posek who, one, is talking straight to Balabatim often, but two, thinks that Balabatim deserve serious halachic analysis, mixed with, as we'll see, philosophy and pragmatism, right? But he's totally open about his considerations. I was debating. My favorite tshuva in this book I really can't do, unless we had a really long time, because 35 pages long, which was a fascinating tshuva, which is worth reading, on whether rabbis were allowed to or should volunteer to be chaplains in the American Army, which was a complicated analysis of whether you're allowed to put yourself in a situation which might become pikuach nefesh. Right? Right, it's a very complicated analysis of the Balamor, and then the Rambam, and the nature of onus, and the difference between Parakei Halacha Dalet and Parakei Halacha Vav, of the different types of onus according to the Rambam, and which one you're putting yourself into, and what is the basis of them lumdishly and philosophically and psychologically. It's like a beautiful, beautiful tshuva, but we don't have time for it. So I figured the first one in the book is a good one because you're doing Avodah Zarah, and at least to you the guys who are in Ray Ginsburg share, you actually touched on some of these sugyas. So you'll appreciate the lumdus. I figured it was a good one also. So this is the first piece in this book. And again, it's written in English, but I want you to see how it functions as a tshuva, And we'll sort of make points as we go along. You can follow along with me, but it's pretty easy to read. So the background is as follows, right? The question is depiction of human images on stained glass windows in Interfaith Chapel. That was the shaila, right? So this is the background. 1949, Myron C. Taylor, former U.S. representative to the Vatican and former chairman of the board of U.S. Steel, donated $1.5 million to his alma mater, Cornell University, for the construction of an interfaith center that would bear the name of his wife, Annabelle. The various religious denominations on campus at the time participated in an umbrella group known as the Cornell United Religious Work. Okay, fine. They asked the Rav, right, there were sketches of human beings on it, right, from Yoshua, Yirmiyahu, with psukim from the Bible, and there was this guy, Dr. Konvitz, who was apparently a Talmud scholar, communal rabbi, and a member of the Agudas HaRabbanim, who really didn't like these pictures. So he approached the president, who didn't really want to get involved unless there was an authoritative ruling. So they said, let's ask the Rav. Okay? Now, it's interesting, the last background point from this is that they told him the question was about the stained glass windows, and we don't want to know about the Interfaith Chapel. Right? That's not what the Shiloh is about. It's about right? Okay. Now, again, we've talked about this before, that the job of a posek isn't just to make lamdish arguments, it's also to persuade, to try to get good policy. This happens to be a short, but very beautifully done tshuva in English. And, and when, in a few weeks I'll come up with some sort of shaila. If you want to write in English, that's fine, right? You can see how it can be done really well. Okay, so this is what he writes. He says, Dear Dr. Konvitz, I acknowledge receipt of your letter, November 22nd. I gave serious thought to the problem you presented me, and I fully realize its extreme urgency and grave implications. The subject matter must be analyzed under both a formal and philosophico-historical halachic aspect. Right, so first of all, he tells you, right, that his approach is posek, and this is like classic Rav. It's what you would expect from him. In Hebrew, lumdus, right, and philosophy, right, in Hebrew, right, right, hashkafa and lumdus, right. Since the problem has arisen under unique social circumstances, halachic formalism and syllogism will not suffice to solve it. Central historical realities with their deep-seated philosophical meaning must be taken into account. So he tells you right off the bat, I'm going to give you psak, and then I'm going to give you hashkafic framing, meaning I'm going to tell you what halacha is, I'm going to tell you what I think you should do. Right? But he's very clear about it, and writes it very eloquently. Said, such an approach is not a novelty in the approach of halacha. Right? And then he says, don't think this is a chiddush that I'm answering with hashkafa. Right? Again, I love it, you can translate this, right? He writes in English, but right in Hebrew would be, right, it's not a chiddush, right? And many a time, our rabbis preferred it to the purely abstract method of analysis. Let us discuss now the formal halachic viewpoint. So you guys tell me, what do you think the halachic issues are?
In terms of making it, in terms of buying it, in
Good,
terms of
right?
praying there?
Good, right? So those are going to be issues. Yeah. So he said there are two fundamental prohibitions against the making of images. One deals with the making or possessing of idols, objects of worship, and is not limited to a specific design. Any object or any form which is considered as a representation of deity or is endowed with a transcendental divine quality is included in this injunction. Right?
It's not the impression I got from the Gemara's.
Really?
Yeah.
Why not?
Mentions specific things. Doesn't say any form.
But the Gemara says, why darkon? Because that's what they did then. I got a shaila a few weeks ago. Someone said to me, I bought a mug. Same guy who asked me all the shailas. Right? I got a mug. Right? I got a mug. Not a mug. A goblet, which has a picture of an image of a dragon. Right?
Darkon is mutter, but it was aser if you were as a metzia.
Right. So I said, of course it's mutter, because... Right? Nowadays, it's clear, right? He bought it like some, schlocky trinket shop in London, right? It's not meant as a desire. It's not like anything magical about darkon. Right. The point is, it's things which are, right, representative of an deity.
He's talking about Metzia or Asiya there.
What?
He's talking about Metzia or Asiya. Meaning...
Well, he doesn't say yet.
I thought he was making. Good creation, I thought.
No, with making or possessing, right?
He's equating them or something.
Right, so he says... Right, so the first one is right cultic properties, and the second prohibition applies to the making of images, even if it not be for cultic but artistic purposes. Right, that's it. Right, right. He's saying there's one is cultic purposes, meaning right things which are actually of a desara. That's the mitzia of things which might be divine, and then there's the making of things which is also even for art. Right, a gzera or a daraisa, but derived from avodah zarah.
Yeah.
Right. But
he's saying both of those are the Asir is making, either making it because it's actually a cultic thing, or even...
And the second one is making or finding.
There's two Isuris.
Correct.
Correct.
But you understand how he doesn't... Now, I really like this tshuva, because he barely, right, or at least at the beginning, he doesn't quote any Makaros. Right? First he lays this out in very simple English.
Right.
Well, not simple English, okay. In very clear English, not in Lumdish English, okay, not jargon English. Right? Maybe his jargon, but not like Lumdish jargon, just, I'm really, really smart and speak 78 languages jargon, yeah. He said, the second, fine. This law includes 3 kinds of figured subjects. 1, the human form. 2, any representation of transcendental, separate intelligences, such as angels, srafim, the 4 figures of the holy chariot, etc.
Okay, so he's qualifying.
And 3, images of the astral world, such as stars and planets, which in antiquity were conceived as deities. Right? Which is, by the way, it's just a very succinct summary of the sugya. It's actually really quite... Sure. I thought you'd appreciate having done this sugya, right? So quite succinct. Right? He said, besides these 3 classes of figures, it is also prohibited to create or possess any design which is usually associated with a cultic or religious motif, though the objective meaning of this work is purely artistic. As to the prohibition against the human form, a controversy developed in the Middle Ages. One school of thought maintained that it applied to both sculptures and paintings, while another school has adopted a more liberal attitude and restricted the law only to protruding 3-dimensional works of art. Right? Rambam versus Ramban. Right?
For which?
Suras Adam. Right? Suras Adam, which is...
is it going to be important, or is it just kind of the way he's given over the thing? Like, should I be trying to...
Yeah, well, they know the sugya, so... Yes, he said there's Machlok is Rambam...
The Rambam Boleh, it has to be Boleh.
The Rambam says Boleh, the Ramban says not. Yeah. Right? We paskin like the Rambam.
Right.
So the Ramban hold that anything that is in the form of any of these cultic...
No, Suras Adam would be also even flat.
Yeah, if it's flat,
right? Right? Now he says, at the same time, another question came to the fore. Whether the prohibition against the aforementioned 3 categories of artistic figures applied to possession as to manufacture. The religious practice has accepted the more liberal viewpoint in both cases. Right? Meaning, only bolate, and it's, right, the ikar problem is making it. Right? In the most traditional Jewish homes, paintings and photographs are to be found. Right? Ray says, we allow, right, 2-dimensional, even making, right? The Ramban says, you're never allowed to make a 2-dimensional person, you might be able to hold on to it. Right? The Rav says, the halacha, we paskin, that you're allowed to, right, even make, and for sure own, 2-dimensional human figures. That's Shittas Rambam. Right? Many do not object even to the display of sculptures if their aesthetic character and universal meanings are so obvious they exclude the possibility of association with a cultic motif. Right?
One more time.
Right? Many do not object even to the display of sculptures if their aesthetic character and universal meaning are so obvious they exclude the possibility of association with a cultic motif.
Like a kid's doll or something like that.
Right. Right? Do you understand how he captured that lumdas? Right? Like the people who say it's muvuzeh, right? Or something like that. Right? They capture that lumdas. Right? It's a very nicely constructed tshuva here. Right? It says, in regard to this synagogue, we do not find in the halakhic literature, with the exception of a single passage in the Chilta quoted by Rashi in Exodus 20:20, a specific prohibition against paintings or any other design representing the human figure. On the contrary, our sages were more tolerant towards the display of human images in the synagogue than in the home. Yeah. In the tractate Rosh Hashanah and Avodah Zarah, we find that a statue of the king was displayed in a Babylonian synagogue, and nevertheless, Rav, Shmuel, and Levi did not refrain from worshipping there, though they would have objected to the exhibition of the effigy in the private home. Right? You ever think about this? Right? The Rav points out that in the Gemara, it says that if the problem is what? Achshash is chshad, then the shul is better. Right? It's less problematic than the home. Right. And therefore, the implicit claim that some people think that the shul is more stringent is keneged the sugya.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's the issue of chshad, public places are better. The reason for this distinction between synagogue and home is that while in the synagogue no one would suspect the community of having the statue for a religious purpose, such suspicion would be warranted concerning a private home. In the course of time, however, tradition has reversed its attitude. Right, now this is a fascinating move by the Rav, where he points out that in the sugya, from a formal halachic perspective, shuls are less problematic than the home.
But the minhag is the opposite.
And the minhag is the opposite. Right? While pictures were not banned from Jewish homes, as I've mentioned, the synagogue has excluded any image of man from its decorative motives. Moreover, many halachic scholars insisted upon utmost simplicity of the synagogue and disapproved of elaborate ornaments in general. Maimonides, for instance, objected to murals and mosaics which would confront the worshiper during his devotional meditation because they might serve as a distraction. Right? So what does the Rav say? From the vantage point of Avodah Zarah, which is the bigger issue, shul is less problematic. But the minhag ha'olam has been to focus not on the Avodah Zarah aspects, but on the distraction aspects, right? And this desire for shuls to be simple and pushed in the opposite direction, right? Because of, right, a different halachic concern.
Right.
An even stronger dislike was shown towards figured subjects such as animals. Rav Eliakim of Cologne, right, this is quoted in the Beis Yosef, ordered his congregation to remove from the synagogue a carpet which had animal designs woven in it. Likewise, we know of a controversy concerning the display of the Lion of Judah above the ark which raged in the 16th century, in which Moses of Trani, Rameir of Padua, and Rabbi Yosef Karo were involved. There were many synagogues that did not tolerate panels representing animals. Yet again, the practice was more liberal, and all figures, with the exception of the human form, were introduced as architectural designs of the synagogue. As to the anthropomorphic symbols, there is almost unanimity of disapproval. And then the Rav swallows something, which is actually a huge methodological deal. Right? His next sentence is, the fact that some excavations disclose such motives is irrelevant to us. The tradition as such has rejected them. Right? Right? This is a big machlokes, right? Does archaeology...
What was archaeology show, though? What was
that we have mosaics from the time of the Beis HaMikdash, where shuls have suns and moons and stars, right? And people... And the Rav just says, okay, fine. So people made a mistake, right? What the Rav really saying...
So he's
right?
saying people made a mistake, or our tradition rejects that?
Well, I don't know what he's saying. Right? He's saying it doesn't matter. He says, right, they're different...
That's not the minhag anymore, so it doesn't really matter.
Correct. Now, it's not clear what he says, right? Some poskim are menaseach, it is, look, so maybe they made a mistake, right? Yeah, there were always people who violated Yisurim. Like, maybe they made a mistake, right? Or it doesn't matter, right? What the Rav is telling you, again, Rav Schechter disagrees with this, right? Or, right, I mean, I don't know if he does, but he seems to, right? The Rav is just saying, look, we look at, right, the Rav is making a methodological claim. We look at the history of Psak. I don't really care what you know from archaeology and history.
Can you read that last sentence again?
Right, the fact that some excavations disclose such motives is irrelevant to us. The tradition as such has rejected them.
As such, meaning like now.
Right, the tradition.
Doesn't necessarily mean the halachic tradition. Like
no, here he means halachic tradition. Right, I mean he says
like the minhag.
Well, he means some combination of halacha. See, I'm not sure. I'm not sure because he may be talking about even the mosaics that have sun, moons, and stars, which according to halacha would be aser. Right, and this is one of the big kashas. He's saying it doesn't matter. Right, halacha is halacha, and history is history. Right. Right, which is actually, it's amazing how much the Rav actually swallows. Yeah. Right, in like sort of. This English Jew, he doesn't like spell it out, but he's making a claim about how Psak works. Is I look at minhag, and I look at halachic text. I don't look at evidence of what was thousands of years ago, even if it goes against the tradition that I have.
It's more like precedent.
What?
It's more like precedent than minhag.
Right, meaning it's halachic. It's minhag. Meaning it's minhag like of the last few hundred years, right? And written Psak, meaning it's the precedent, both minhag and written Psak of it's the trajectory of Psak that we know, not what happened 2,000 years ago. He's not looking to undermine it.
Is it that, like, because the Gemara says it's Asher, or because, like, Rishonim or Achorim said it was Asher?
Well, the next question should answer that, right? Okay. That which one is driving him more? Is it the Sugya? So it's partially the Sugya, clearly, but it's also, the next line is, now the question arises, why the halachic tradition revised the Talmudic law, which permitted the display of human likeness in the synagogue. Right, so what's he really bothered by?
Why would we go against the Sugya?
Why, to justify the minhag that seems to be not in this case, usher. Right, sometimes you have a minhag that's against the sugya. Right, it's not just a chumrah, it's an ironic chumrah. Right, that in the time of the Gemara, when they focused on Avodah Zarah, the shul was less problematic than home.
Yeah.
But the minhag has been to treat the shul as more makbid, right, be more machmir in shul because of concerns of concentration. Like, how do we go 180 degrees in terms of what we were worried about? Right, he's bothered about the implication of the sugya versus the implication of precedent / minhag. So he says, in order to find an adequate answer, we must place the problem in a philosophical and historical perspective. So what does the Rav do? Again, methodologically, it's a fascinating thing to watch his mind, which is, if Lum just doesn't explain it, because the sugya says the opposite of what we do, then you could come up with a halachic explanation. And what does the Rav do? Says no.
It's a shkafik or...
Exactly, right? If the halacha is one way, but hashkafically, it's not a contradiction. If it was a contradiction, he'd have to resolve it. It's a tension, right? That's what it is. Right? I mean, he's saying it's not a contradiction, right? No one's saying it's usur. We're just saying that it used to be we were more sensitive to the shul, now less sensitive to the shul, now we're more sensitive to the shul, right? In neither case, you're saying it's usur per se,
right?
But why is it that we've come to treat the shul with more chumrah than we do the home, which from a halachic perspective doesn't make sense? He says his method is not reinterpret the sugya, but is to assume that there's a second dimension.
Yeah.
Right? And bring it in, is say, well, it must be that the minhag developed because of hashkafa, not halacha. Right? It's a fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Like watching his mind as a posek is actually it's very interesting. He says, the human figure as a decorative motif in the synagogue conflicts with the very essence of prayer. The latter expresses the creature consciousness, i.e., the awareness of absolute dependence on and surrender to God. The feeling of centrality of man is superseded by one of helplessness, worthlessness, and wretchedness. Since any anthropomorphic emblem in the synagogue conveys an anthropocentric idea, it places emphasis on the unique role that has been assigned to man. Such design was ruled out. Right? Now, what does he say? Right? He comes up with a chiddush philosophically, which is that the essence of tefillah is that human beings are
low.
What?
Low.
Are low, and we turn to God. But putting images of man implies an anthropocentric, right? A worldview which revolves around man, when shul is where we revolve around God and is the place where we're supposed to inculcate, right? Ma enosh ki tizkarenu, right? This is basically him channeling Tehillim Aleph, right? That shul is where we push towards more than ever a God-centric rather than people-centric view.
And the tension he's dealing with is just why we seem to be so makbid in a shul on things which are not in the house. And
right.
Also not dealing with...
Correct. Even though, from a vantage point of Avodah Zarah and the chshad-related issues, the shul is better because it's a public place.
And he's saying you can't just explain it with distraction because we have these other... figures in the shul.
Correct, right? And what's he trying to explain? He's saying, yes, he said, right, what he's trying to explain is how is it that the Gemara, from an Avodah Zarah perspective, was less worried in a shul? We're more worried. He said, so you could just say it's distraction, which is what the Rambam says. The problem is, the minhag has been to have elaborate artistic work in shul, but not humans, right? Which doesn't work either way, because from an Avodah Zarah perspective, it's less problematic.
Humans?
Right? Shul over a home.
Okay.
Right? Shul over a home. Right? And from a distraction perspective, there's no difference between animals and people.
Right.
And the Rav says it must be that the answer is hashkafa. Mm-hmm. And the hashkafa is that the minhag came to emphasize in shul that God is the center and not human beings, and therefore to avoid anything which implies the centrality of a human being.
And probably especially with Christianity having...
He's going to get to that in a minute. Don't worry, he's going to get there, right? But it's interesting, right, that what's the Rav saying, right? The Rav is saying, look,
It's also
right, first thing we do is we understand the Lamdus, right? Then we watch how it traced itself through precedent, and right? He goes Sugya, right? Sugya, he doesn't go in depth, but he actually pretty succinctly summarized the main Lamdus. Precedent, right? Rambam, Ramban, Re'elazar Kalon. He actually summarized there the sheet quoted in the Beis Yosef just for a non-expert, right? Then he says, but now I got to go through minhag and halacha, and it turns out that minhag and precedent, right, don't align, right, or intention, not in contradiction in this case, intention in terms of the emphasis they put versus the sugya. So how do I bridge the gap? There must be an outside factor, and for the Rav, we'll see, he has two factors. One is hashkafa, and the second is going to be, right, it's historical, right?
It's also worth noting that the case in the Gemara where they daven in the shul is because Amos. I mean, it was the king was
in a chanami.
So it wouldn't have the same problem.
For sure. He's just saying it's less problematic. That's all.
Right.
Okay. So he says, since any anthropocentric emblem in the synagogue conveys an anthropocentric idea. Oh, no, I read this one. In the case of the Babylonian synagogue, the king's effigy served as a mere political symbol placed, in all probability, by a royal edict, and did not constitute an aesthetic or decorative pattern designed to introduce the motif of axiological supremacy of man into the religious experience.
I know what he's saying. I have no idea what those were.
His point was, right, there, he said, in the case of the Gemara, he said, now he goes back to the Gemara. How does this, right, he said, okay, I now explain the Hashkafa. Why isn't the Hashkafa against the Gemara? Because he said, that person, right, that effigy, right, that human image was there for political reasons. Right? It wasn't there to emphasize the uniqueness of man. It was just there for political reasons. So it didn't have the hashkafic problem. Right? Therefore, it only had a halachic problem. And from a halachic problem, public places are less problematic than private places. But if we were to put a human being in by our own choice, rather than because the king put it,
there's no chashash.
There's no chashad. Right? There's no chashad, and there's no but if we were to put it, there would be a philosophical problem.
Right.
And that is the reason why the rabbis did not raise any objection to display the statue. However, and now he comes to Mati's point, right, and he says, however, there is a more cogent reason which explains the deviation of practice from Talmudic theory. He said, I have a good reason why the lumdus doesn't fit what we do. And this is to be sought in historical circumstances, which necessitated such a change. He said, in Hanami, right, first I've explained why it might not be a change from the Talmud. But he said, no, it really is. Right? There's a good reason why the Gemara was less worried about having an image of man, and we're very worried. And that is, not because of Avodah Zarah, not even Hashkafa, but because of the outside concern, namely Christianity, that this was imitating, right? It's a chukas akum type thing. Right? And he says, the icon in the Christian world is a typical ecclesiastical motif that suggests to us the Christological idea of God-man, which is associated to the Christian faith with the very exactly with the very act of worshiping Deus abscontis, that's Latin, being too remote and transcendent to be approached through the medium of worship. I will translate into regular English. Right? He says, having an image of a person in Christian faith was important because their fundamental belief is that God is too great for human beings to relate to, and therefore God had to put himself in a man, right? Had to become a human being so that we could relate to him, and therefore the icon became central to Christian faith because it was the symbol of the fact that in order for man to relate to God, God became man. Right? That's the fundamental belief, right? That God had to become man. Right? That's the Catholic belief.
Yeah.
Right? He said, hence, the unequivocal iconoclastic attitude of Judaism towards the display of human images in houses of worship. Right? I mean, once human images became associated with Christian theology, and the blurring of the lines between God and man that was implicit in Christian theology, Jews who didn't want to be seen as blurring the line between humans and mankind avoided human images, even if they're technically mutter, in the context of shuls, which is a place of worship.
Yeah.
To what our sages in a non-Christian Babylonia did not object, our forefathers in Christian countries were very susceptible. I wish to emphasize that this is not merely a medieval addendum to the law. And then he says, you'll tell me, how do the Rishonim have the right to change the halacha?
Yeah.
He says, no, it expresses its very spirit. Mm-hmm. It's a different application of the same yesod. Right?
They're not changing halacha, it's just a philosophical...
Correct, but he's saying it's not just that, it's also the law. Right? It's that. Right? He's saying this is not random philosophy. Right? I mean, first, what was his first move? To say maybe this is an external philosophy. Then he says, no, the same philosophy that led Chazal to not be worried about human images in public leads us to be worried about it. Because what was the chshad concern? Right? How is this viewed? In Babylonia, if it was in a public place, no one would think you're worshipping an idol. In a Christian context, it creates that very chshad, because once you start putting human iconography...
Which isn't there in a private home. You don't feel
what?
You don't feel
which you don't have... That's exactly his point. Right. He's saying, it's not just hashkafa randomly. It's actually the same yesod of the Gemara, but refracted through the realities of a Christian world.
Yeah, why does he even have to go that far? I mean, it's not like the medieval scholars are coming and saying that it's usher now.
We shout them, right? Yeah. No, correct. Well, no, they did. Well, they sort of did. But he's saying, as I've emphasized,
it's that way because.
He's saying it's not that they're saying it's usher, but he's saying it captures the same philosophical idea behind the original halacha, right? Meaning.
Yeah, no, I understand why we'd be naive not to have it, but we didn't change the halacha.
No, that's what he's saying.
Why can't you say there actually is now a chashad?
Well, so that's what he sort of says. I mean,
So
you'll see what he
is
says.
usher. Like, it would actually be
Well,
halal.
right. I mean, that's sort of what he says, right?
Shot works, but
Right.
Right. As he said. So he continues. He says, as I've emphasized before, the law prohibits the representation of any figure or form which only alludes to a cultic motif, and the human figure in a synagogue, though its objective meaning be of artistic nature, comes under this category. This also explains the iconoclastic mood which was characteristic of the Jews of the Second Commonwealth, to whom the human forms suggested the deities of the Hellenistic world. What?
Second temple, I think.
Yes. Right? Human history, or the Roman period. History records that twice they violently resisted the attempts of the Roman authorities to display the likeness of the Caesars in Jerusalem or in the temple. Right? He says, why is it that in the time of the Gemara in Babylonia they allowed them to put up political images in shul? But we know historically that in Rome they refused.
They worship man in Rome.
Because they worshiped man. Right? Because the gods of Rome looked like men. Right, and therefore an image of Caesar reminded them of, right, an image of Zeus. Right? While their opposition during the reign of Caius was caused by the fact that the statue was to be worshipped as a deity, their opposition during the time of Tiberius, the royal image stamped on the army standards of the Roman legion, is to be explained on the grounds of their dislike for the human image as such. Reading Josephus or Philo, we cannot help but be struck by the historical fact that our ancestors in Palestine objected to the exhibition of any human figure in the holy city. Right? Which is also interesting that the Rav is influenced by Philo and Josephus in history. Right? The same tradition was later...
Wasn't he just saying that you
yes,
don't get it?
Correct. But if it works with the sugyas, right? I mean, what's he saying, right? It's...
Wait, what are you talking about?
I'm saying, like, before...
No, before he said, I don't care about history. But he's saying, I do, if it works with the Masorah, right, then it's a good raya. Right? If it works against Masorah, then we reject it.
Yeah, I think it makes
sense.
sense.
Right. I mean, no, it makes sense.
Yeah, that's
right. He's saying, right?
They wouldn't allow any human images in Yerushalayim at all?
Correct. Right, I mean, they fought it to the death.
Anywhere in the city?
Correct.
Wow.
I mean, they fought the Romans when they would try to do it. The same tradition was later adopted by the medieval synagogue, both in the cases of... in both cases, an anthropomorphic symbol suggested a religious idea, and the criterion for approval or disapproval of design was not its objective content, but the subjective impression it conveys. Right? Right? That's the Kshad argument. Right? The premise is also valid in our particular problem. An anthropomorphic symbol which will form part of the decoration of a stained glass window, which is itself a purely ecclesiastical motif reminiscent of the medieval Gothic cathedrals. Right? The Rav in general thought that stained glass windows were usher in shul because they were chukas akum by definition, right? And the way you say chukas akum in English is, which is itself a purely ecclesiastical motif reminiscent of the medieval Gothic cathedrals. That's I guess I say it in English. Regardless of the universal character of the figures, will immediately, by the sheer law of association, be identified with the usual Christological motif. The chapel will certainly be fashioned in the style of church architecture rather than that of a synagogue, and the human figures, made by an artist who specialized in church decoration, will most probably display some characteristic features of church paintings that will eclipse their universal meaning. The overall impression of the superficial observer will undoubtedly be one of religious nature. Therefore, my recommendation would be not to agree to any representation of the human form in spite of its universal character. Okay? Now, the Rav maneuvers. Right? And this is a classic move in Psak. And remember, I've said this over and over. The job of a posek is what?
Also a policy.
Yes, and therefore not only to answer the question he was asked, but answer the question that should have been asked. So remember the introduction? We just want to know about the stained glass windows. Don't weigh in on the Interfaith chapel. So what does the Rav do? In conclusion, I wish to take the liberty of giving expression to another aspect of the problem, although I have not been consulted about it. Right? He's very, very good at this. Right? He's like, that's not my job as Posek. My job as Posek is not just to answer the question, but is to answer the question that you should have asked. Right? I strongly object to the use of an interfaith chapel. The halacha is unequivocally opposed to it, and this prohibition is even more strict than that concerning human images. I understand, of course, what the statement implies in terms of public relations. However, I cannot help but be frank and outspoken about it. The idea of a common house of prayer is absolutely irreconcilable with the Jewish philosophy of worship. This attitude stems neither from intolerance or narrow-mindedness, nor from a feeling of superiority of dogma or dogmatic charism, but from a deep It's charisma, I guess. I don't know. From a deep philosophical insight into the essence of worship. We identify ourselves with our Gentile neighbors in all matters of collective endeavor, social, political, and cultural activities. There should be no retreat on the part of the Jew from the full participation in all phases of national life, and we are committed to all American institutions. However, the worship of God is not a social or collective gesture, but is a genuinely individual, most personal, intimate, and tender relationship which cannot be shared with anyone else. That is why the use of a common chapel is objectionable from the Jewish viewpoint that it insists upon the uniqueness and individuality of the form of service and the place in which we worship. Moreover, the halacha operates with the concept of the holiness of the synagogue. Right? So first he says it's asur, al pi halacha, by which I mean hashkafa. Right? It's against tefillah.
He didn't even say halacha. He just sort of...
Correct. He said halacha.
We said first.
Halacha is unequivocally opposed to it.
Then he just gave like a... He didn't give like
correct. Meaning, it's interesting, right? He says, my first opposition is actually hashkafic. Mm-hmm. Moreover, the halacha operates within the concept of the holiness of the synagogue. Mm-hmm. The main characteristic of holiness are uniqueness, separateness, a state of being consecrated to, determined by, and directed upon a single goal, a specific mode of worship. And then he makes a very interesting lumdish argument, which is, a shul is defined by kedusha. Kedusha means designation, right? Right? Exclusive designation. That's what the word means in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Lekadesh.
Right.
And therefore, the notion of a shul which will function for other religions is not a shul because you can't have kedusha if there's no designation. Mm-hmm. And therefore, this isn't a shul plus. Anything which is a shul plus is by definition not a shul because it lacks kedusha, because it lacks designation.
That just means it doesn't have kedusha.
Correct. Oh, he hasn't gotten. Yeah, he said to be dedicated. Sorry, the holiness, like of the sanctity, and then he makes a nice. Then he makes a nice hashkafic move, right? He says the holiness of the synagogue, like the sanctity of the home, finds expression or respect for its privacy and exclusiveness. So this is one of the Rav's favorite words ever. This paradox becomes more striking when we consider the discrepancy between the Jewish service and the Christian form of worship. The Christian Orthodox Church sees in the act of worship a sacramental, mysterious performance which is fraught with otherworldliness and beatitude. I didn't pronounce that wrong. Whatever. Right. And is rooted in the miracle of transubstantiation. That's
true.
Yes, that is true.
One step ahead of him.
Transubstantiation, like when you eat the cracker and the wine, and you become part of God.
Eating Jesus'
That
flesh.
the cracker is his flesh.
The whole organization of the service and the arrangement of its surroundings, like the passive role of the audience, the soft music of the organ, the stained glass window, and the Gothic style of the architecture, serves one purpose, namely the intensification of a feeling of supernaturalness, strangeness, and meta-rationality. In contrast to this, the Jewish service is distinguished by its simplicity. It asserts itself in a dialogue between God and man on this level of this worldliness and concreteness. It is conducted in an atmosphere of rationality, familiarity, and naturalness. Hence, I am unable to comprehend how it is possible to dedicate a chapel to mutually exclusive ways of worship, and how one could reconcile the Jewish service with alien architectural surroundings which symbolize the mysterium magnum of the Eucharist rite. Right, which is a fancy way of saying, what the heck are you doing davening where they think they're becoming part of Jesus? Right? Like, how do you not think that's a problem? Right? He said, the halachic law, like any other sound religious norm, insists upon worship keeping up with the original themes and motif which reflect the living transcendental consciousness of the respective religious communities. Meaning, a shul or a church should represent your philosophy of life. Okay, good. Standardization and communization of man's relationship to God, the most subjective, intimate, and primordial experience, is as absurd as a similar attempt to standardize and communize human love, passion, and romance would prove to be. The shibboleth of the religious act is in its singularity. I am firmly convinced that it is our privilege and duty as Jews and Americans to oppose the Christianization of the synagogue, either in its architectural form or in the mode of worship, as it would be the privilege and duty of a good Christian to object to the Judaization of the church. The psychological consequences of such a decisive step as the use of an interfaith chapel might easily prove disastrous. The students of today are the future leaders of tomorrow, and after having attended services for 4 consecutive years in Interfaith Chapel, in an atmosphere that expresses more the spirit of the church than of the synagogue, they may later be inclined to introduce a church-synagogue center in their communities. Taking into consideration the specific mentality of American Jews, with their almost neurotic fear of anti-Semitism, such an institution may have strong appeal to them. We must not do anything which could promote such a drift toward complete extinction of the boundary line between church and synagogue. I wish to express my high regard and esteem for your courageous stand on this matter, which behooves a worthy son of my late illustrious friend, Ray Joseph Konvitz. I'm certain that if he were alive, he would give you a similar opinion. Sincerely yours, Joseph Soloveitchik. P.S. I would greatly appreciate it if you would keep the contents of this letter confidential. Please do not show it to anyone, except those persons who are directly concerned with this matter. And apparently...
P.S. in the book?
Yes. Anyways, so like I said, I haven't actually really liked this tshuva. I haven't really liked this as a tshuva because, first of all, I think it is a masterful tshuva in terms of capturing a lot of the letters without actually going into it in depth, but accurately. Right? You understand, he actually accurately summarized the main sugyot, the main machlokas Rambam Ramban, the main shitas and Shulchan Aruch, right? In a few paragraphs in English, right? What I like about it also is, you see a few things methodologically about how the Rav thought as a posek. Right? The Rav said, first of all, what's his, right? If we talk about the factors of psak. First of all, he starts with sugya. Then he goes to minhag and precedent. But he takes in all three. And he actively rejects historical things that don't relate to those 3 factors. If they support it, like Josephus, fine. If it goes against it, then it's irrelevant. Right? These are what I look at. Right? Then he says, okay, if there's a gap between the implications of a sugya and the implications of precedent / minhag, so then I need to explain it. How do I explain it? Well, if it's not from within the sugya, then it's from out. What options does he have? Hashkafa.
Historical.
And history. Right? So first he gives hashkafa, and then he says, by the way, history. And he says, by the way, history isn't non-halachic. It is. Because certain isurim, by their definition, are contextually defined, such as chukas akum and chshad. And he said, therefore, because of the nature of Christianity, the chshad and the chukas akum components are more intense. We're almost done. Are more intense, right, with human images than they were in the time of Chazal.
Right.
And therefore, he says, bisman hazeh, a accurate understanding of the circumstances will generate a different isser based on hashkafic grounds and halachic grounds, which are from a different isser, an external isser, which only is relevant if you understand why this chukas akum chshad, which requires you to understand a broad historical perspective. Right? But what does the Rav never do?
The actual sources.
Well, I mean, he does here and there, right? He quotes Gemara, right? He quotes the Rambam.
Actually, the Gemara just kind of said that.
He said this is the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. He gives you the daf. Okay. That's it, right? What?
No.
Right? I mean, he doesn't go through the sugya. He tells this is what emerges from Rosh Hashanah and Avodah Zarah, and he gives you the daf.
Does he ever say actually what to do, or he just kind of says what should be done? Like, does he? In other words, does he ever say like a line that says, "and therefore you should not do this"?
Yeah, that was the whole point of this, right? It was don't do it.
The point of it, yeah, okay.
Right? No, that was don't do it. Right? That was the whole thing, right?
Said more than
the
a
line.
line.
Do not do this.
Well, I mean, it was. It just the English was much fancier than don't do it. Right? Don't do it.
I probably didn't understand.
Right?
Judeo-historical.
I think that was, I am firmly convinced that it is our privilege and duty as Jews and Americans to oppose the Christianization of the synagogue, either in its architectural form or in the mode of worship, as it would be the privilege and duty of a good Christian to object to the Judaization of the church. I'm pretty sure that was, don't do it. Right? In very fancy English. Right? Or, alternatively, therefore my recommendation would be not to agree to any representation of the human form in spite of its universal character. Right? He was pretty clear. Right?
So what's he missing?
Right, what's also interesting is that he uses machshava, right? What is it? What is, right? Why does he capture all the lamdas and machshava in the way he does? I think it's pretty clear that, right, the Rav very much understands the role of Posek is to convince. And he's talking to someone who's not going to be convinced by a lamdish argument. Right. So he frames even the lamdish arguments in philosophical, right, hashkafic, pragmatic, right? Meaning he acknowledges what he's talking about.
Right.
Now, a few other things that I appreciate about the Rav as a posek is he's talking hashkafically, but he doesn't hide. Right? He's actually, right, certain people will try to pretend that halacha is hashkafa. He doesn't. Right? He's very clear. Sugya, precedent. Minhag, hashkafa, pragmatism. Right? Right? He understands the role of a posek is to offer advice which includes all those elements. But that doesn't mean that he has to pretend that it's all halacha. He understands that he can try to compel somebody even though he's acknowledging that it's not psak. Right, in the halachic sense. Right.
It might actually be better, like easier to convince him using.
Correct. Right. I think that's right. I mean, I think some people think that it's better. Let's hide behind halacha. I don't think it's true. Right. You read the Rav's lever. Right. He actually makes a persuasive argument without pretending that this is a formal argument. I mean, it sort of is. Right. I mean, chukas akum is one, though it's a contextually defined one. Though he never says this is chukas akum. I mean, that's what he means clearly, but he never says those words.
Yeah.
And I think. The point that I noted in the middle, which was he understands that the role of a posek is not just to answer the question that he's asked, but it's to answer the question he isn't asked, right? Is to actually try to get people to do the right thing, right? And that was when he said, in conclusion, I wish to take the liberty of giving expression to another aspect of the problem, although I've not been consulted about it, right? He's saying, I know that's not what you want to know from me, but that's what I think you need to hear, right? So, I really do think it is fascinating to watch the Rav's mind as a posek. Because as a posek, he thinks, first of all, that even people who don't necessarily understand Hebrew, right, because he understands this letter is going to be shared with not just the rabbi he's talking to, but to the, right, he says to the people who are involved with the question. He thinks that even the average balabas who doesn't know anything about sugyas deserves at least an articulate, intelligent understanding of the sugya. Right? That's actually a striking claim about how psak works. Right? When you think about it, right, he so much so he's writing it in English, right? Meaning he understands that the person who's going to look at it is not going to understand this in Hebrew. But despite the fact that he's not going to understand it in Hebrew, he thinks he deserves a basic understanding of the sugya. He also thinks he deserves the honest understanding of what's halacha, what's minhag, what's precedent, what's hashkafa, what's pragmatism, what's advice, right? But he gives it to him, he gives it to all of it, right? But he also very much understands that to be a posek, like I said, is to answer the question that you weren't asked and to persuade. Right? Right? This is not, in any way, shape, or form, a tshuva that just informs. Right? It's not. Right? This is not a tshuva that you read where it's like, here's my opinion, do what you want. Right? He is, right, formulating everything in such a way as to pull at someone's heartstrings, right? Or to pull at their rationality, or to pull at their historical consciousness, or their social consciousness, right? You're making this in Cornell because you think it's going to help the Jewish students. It won't, because it's going to push them towards hiding their Jewishness, to Christianizing the shul, right? You don't think, right? He's saying you don't understand what you're doing. You think this is how you're going to strengthen Judaism, right? It's wrong. It's the opposite. Right? You're strengthening the breakdown of religion. Right? Meaning he understands that his job is to persuade. Right? Anyways, I also thought it added to your sugya, right? Since you did it. Like I said, it really is fascinating to me that like the Rav, for all that he really was, the major personality in like modern Orthodoxy in America, really doesn't have halachic tshuvot written, right? So much of what he's halachic shita are like everyone quoting contradictory things that the Rav told them, right? But the few, some of the limited halachic writing they actually have, like I said, it's amazing that he writes in relatively complicated lamdish terms in English.
Yeah.
Right? Which is quite striking about what he thought who his audience was, and what he thought an uneducated balabas deserved in terms of exposure to the actual halachic process. And that's all things I think that are worth thinking about when you think about how should a modern posek function. Should they be writing to only the educated people who understand Hebrew, understand lamdas, or is the job of a posek to make the intricacies of the halachic system and its complexity accessible to people who are not insiders in the halachic system? Right? That clearly seems to be part of the Rav's cheshbon, which is a striking move as a posek, which I think is underappreciated.
Cool.
If you guys have the time to read this 35-page tshuva, I think you'll like it. But this is just, I think, sort of a little bit of an insight. Well, that's the Harag Vel Yavor Ones stuff. Since you also did that, so yeah.